This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpan.
And I'm Yael Barda.
Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we cannot thank you enough. This episode is part of a series in partnership with the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation that we like to call Israel Behind the Headlines, delving deep into and unpacking issues underlying our lives here in Israel. Our guest today is a political geographer, the head of Urbanism, Space and Society Studies at the School of Architecture at the Shamoun College of Engineering in Beersheba, and an adjunct lecturer in geography at the Hebrew University. He's also a research fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Policy Research, in which capacity he recently co-authored a study about Jerusalem called Shared Spaces in Contested Cities, a Model for Analysis and Development. Dr. Marik Shtern, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hi, good afternoon.
So what's there to learn from Jerusalem when it comes to coexistence? To the external observer, such as myself, it seems more like a cautionary tale than a role model.
I would say both, probably, because Jerusalem does entail a very diverse and intense modes of intergroup interactions. In some aspects more than other cities, but at the same time also the level of political violence, of hostility, and all the modes of conflict that we know exist at the same time. So it's highly spatially integrated in some ways, not in residence, but in other ways like work and leisure and consumption and etc. But at the same time, very volatile and conflicted and very intense. So I prefer to call it a laboratory, basically, not something that you can learn a cautionary tale, but also maybe try some things that if they would work in Jerusalem as a very radical case study, it might be even easier to implement them in other urban spaces in Israel.
Your work traces places of sociability and cooperation within material and physical spaces. What is it about the city and the vantage point of geographers and urban planners that helps you see beyond the political and the social cleavage?
So I think that cities basically are places that push different communities together. Right, so if we don't want to encounter the other, we would probably go and live in a rural area, especially in Israel, where you have all kinds of community settlements and our Palestinian villages, and the homogeneous space is at the rural areas in Israel. The diverse spaces in Israel are the cities. And that's something which are fundamental with urban spaces worldwide. This is where diversity are usually happening within cities because you cannot filter people in cities. You cannot choose who's going to be next door, usually, right? Some places you have those gated communities and etc., but in most case studies, you can't really filter who you're going to meet in the shopping mall or who you're going to meet on the streets or even who's going to live next door. So there is an inner force within cities that creates interactions between diverse people, and then you usually also have the reaction of people when they meet such intense diversity. They tend to segregate and try to live with people that look like them within the city. And all these phenomena were inspected in cities, in Chicago, for example, in the beginning of the 20th century. And that's the beginning of urban studies starts with questions like that. How do people navigate within diverse city? They called it the social ecology within such cities. So, and I'm trying to bring political geographical questions into these realities, and especially in a place like Jerusalem or other places in Israel or other contested cities in the world, such, let's say, Nicosia, Belfast, and etc. What happens when a geopolitical conflict infiltrates the daily life in urban spaces, and how do we mitigate that?
So yeah, actually, you preempted my next question, which was going to be, to what extent is Jerusalem unique in that sense? Of course, as you said, it's volatile. The conflict is extremely palpable wherever you look, wherever you go in the city. It feels sometimes like it's sitting on a powder keg, just waiting to erupt, and it not often, but sometimes does. So really, to what extent is this very clear presence of the conflict affect all these questions in relation to other cities where, in post-conflict situations such as Belfast, or maybe in ongoing conflict situations such as Nicosia, and even in a binational space like, I don't know, Montreal or Brussels? I mean, to what extent, how do you place Jerusalem among its community?
So the question, where do you place Jerusalem, is a political question, first of all. It's a question that relates to your political or normative perspective on the topic. In the 90s, the research started talking about Jerusalem as what used to be called divided cities, right? And I do it with my fingers, I mark it, right? Divided cities.
Yeah, inverted commas.
Yeah. Yes. And then they start compare Jerusalem to places like I mentioned, like Belfast or Nicosia, that are divided along ethno-national lines. And I'll come back to this group of cities later. But in the 2000s, especially after the Oslo Accords are kind of crushed, Second Intifada, and the discourse became much more critical towards Israel in general, especially in the West, and the post-colonial perspective kind of emerged, although it always existed among Palestinian scholars, but it became the dominant tone among political geographers in the West as well. And then Jerusalem suddenly is a colonial space, is not a divided space. And that presumes different sets of paradigms, meaning if you talk about Jerusalem as a divided city, you mean there are two national movements fighting at each other. You assume a kind of equal position, even if you accept the political disparities between them. But when you talk about colonial space, you put at the core the asymmetric imbalance of power, and the sense that you have a colonizer and colonized, occupier and occupied, and you especially look at the mechanisms of power, of discrimination, and those dynamics. It's very polarized, and of course you have different sets of research questions in its perspective, and I see myself as a non-dogmatic person, basically. This is also how I study, and what I'm trying to do is to utilize both perspectives. And I ask, basically, where in Jerusalem I can see it as a divided city, and where can I see it as a colonial city, and where also I can see it as a normal city, ordinary city, which is also at the same time. And sometimes the same space entails all three dimensions, maybe in different hierarchies between them. If you go to East Jerusalem, where the settler activity is at the most intensive, of course, the colonialism is most evident and it sets up the rules. But if you go to a shopping mall in West Jerusalem, suddenly you see other forces in power, what I call the ordinary forces, like neoliberalism, globalization, right, which is also very much impactful on our lives and on our attitudes. So yeah, coming back to the classical divided city, if I compare a Jerusalem, for example, then I also need to ask several questions here. I need to ask, how much violence can I find in the city at a specific point of time? Political violence, right? How intense is the conflict? A different set of questions would be, to what degree is the city separated or integrated? And let's talk only about these 2 points and compare Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is at the same time very violent. The conflict is in process. It's intractable, as some of the previous speakers here said. But at the same time, it's not totally divided, as we see, and even with time, it became more spatially integrated. If you talk at Nicosia, for example, there's no political violence in the last 30 years, none at all, but it's almost completely physically separated. So it's kind of a cold conflict, or sleeping conflict, they call it in a sense. Belfast is a post-conflict city in which they try to enforce top-bottom policies of integration, of shared spaces, and there is a resistance, sometimes there is a resistance for these policies bottom-up from some of the local people that tied their identities to the legacies of the troubles and etc. So I try to learn from all of them, of course. I think Belfast teaches us a lot about what can we do with spaces to try to bring communities together. Keeping in mind, of course, that we are not post-conflict, which creates kind of contradictions.
Yeah, in a way, I'm wondering whether you're barking up the wrong tree, because your paper is full of excellent recommendations, really fascinating analysis. And what do you do when the authorities or the regime has for its, official policy to do the exact opposite? I mean, part of what makes, the current authorities in Jerusalem now, what defines them, is this logic of separation between Jews and non-Jews, is this conflict of a perpetuation of the conflict rather than, mitigating it by, bringing people together. It's really, I don't want to be rude here, but really, what's the point of writing this policy report that I don't know if anyone would adopt?
So you'd be surprised.
Okay.
You'd be surprised that even in Jerusalem municipality, we are working with people that are highly motivated to adopt our policy recommendation and are very happy to have something to work with. Because the problem was that we don't have any sets of tools of how to create what we call in Israel, and the translation is bad, a shared society, right? Or shared life, חיים משותפים, in a sense. We are highly professional in separation, in segregation. Talking about the legacies of colonialism, right? The British mandate has taught us how to separate, how to create those quotas and etc. and all those regimes of separation. We inherited that from the British, and that became almost the only logic of space within Israel, not only between Israelis, Jews and Arabs, but also between secular and Datiim and ultra-Orthodox. And there is a very wide system of normativation of segregation in Israel. This is highly normative to create a city for Jews or a village for Arabs or a city for Haredim. And in any other country, it would seem, rude, I don't know if even rude, of blasphemy to even talk about such a thing, right? But in Israel, it's normative, it's the norma. And what my project is in the last, I would say, 20 years, is trying to battle with this paradigm and trying to create alternative. Now, it looks like I'm trying to climb a very high mountain here with all the winds against me, in a sense, especially in the last years. It was a bit easier even under Bibi's regime, but up to 2-3 years ago, the political environment, in some ways, encouraged the ideas of a shared society. If you talk about Rivlin as a president with his programs and etc., there was even money for this. Now it's even harder to find philanthropy of discussing these issues. But anyway, there are no set of tools for policymakers in Israel of how to create a shared society. And not only me, also other organizations are working on, of course, creating those tools. And I'm interested in space. That's my specialty, I would say, as a geographer. And so we work a lot with planners, architects, but not only them, also people engaged in sports, cultural activities, and etc. That has to be an interdisciplinary work. And you'll be surprised to see that, it's not all black in a sense. It's true that the logic is separation, but there are many in the central government. There are people who are seeking this even now within, I would say, mid-level administration, even higher level administration, but especially in municipalities. Next month, I'm going to conduct a workshop for representative of 12 municipalities, what they call the mixed cities in Israel and other, to teach about my model. And that's financed by a governmental office, right? I won't say his name. I can say his name. But anyway, it's a bit undercover. But you see that, it does exist. It does exist because basically there are no alternatives. That's my opinion. But yeah.
There's also another legacy besides the legacies of separation and segregation. So in the political imagination in Israel, there are basically two Jerusalems, right? There's the one from above and the one from below. Yerushalayim shel Mala v'Yerushalayim shel Mata. And so it's Jerusalem as a myth, as this world city, the diplomatic space that is negotiated upon. And then there's the living city with all its nitty-gritty problems and traffic and infrastructures and all that. So how do you address this divide, and how is it present? How do you address this, the Jerusalem from above that is clouding, I think, a lot of the ideas of policymakers, politicians, and sometimes large publics that don't know Jerusalem, the real Jerusalem, but the one that is in their mind, basically?
Yes. I think that we find the most interesting spaces of interaction in the everyday Jerusalem and the ones that has the most potential. As much as you get far away of this symbolic heavenly Jerusalem, it's get a bit easier. It's very hard. Once you get to political Jerusalem, normative Jerusalem, ideological Jerusalem, then people get up on their stance and they are kind of go back to this zero-sum game in a sense. And it happens in both societies. So, but in the last 20 years, there are some marginal spaces that have been developed as places where it's okay to meet each other and kind of act as if there is no conflict. Like, for example, I'm very interested in shopping malls as kind of extraterritorial spaces in which the rules are different. We just had a survey this year in Jerusalem. It hasn't been published yet, that we did, about inter-community relations, in which we asked about several spaces in the city and how much do people feel safe in them. Palestinians, Jews, of course, secular and Haredi, and the safest spaces in Jerusalem are the shopping malls, especially Mamila and Malcha Mall. So,
safe in the way of personal safety?
Personal safety, of how do people define that they feel safe. That's in a city as Jerusalem, where political violence is an issue of every day. That's a very big question when you talk about inter-community relations. And of course, the second question is belonging. So safety comes first, but also a sense of belonging. That's a bit harder to ask, but we asked about safety. But when you go out to spaces which are like, let's say, urban parks, the answers are much more polarized. And then you see that where Palestinians feel safe, for example, the Armon HaNetziv promenade, where they relatively feel safe, this is where the Jews feel most unsecure. And the other way around, Soccer Park and etc., you see the other way around. So it becomes a zero-sum game in the open public urban spaces, which raises up a very interesting question about the role of the private market, the business sector, versus the public sector in those inter-community relations.
Yeah, no, this is really a very interesting issue because this policy paper, Shared Spaces in Contested Cities, is mostly about what the authorities can do to foster personal safety and all sorts of activities to bring people together in a favorable way. I mean, basically refuting the so-called contact hypothesis, just putting people together in the same space is not enough. There needs to be some sort of infrastructure and support for there to be a favorable sort of interaction between them. And it's all directed at the authorities, the municipal authorities. And then, I mean, what you're saying now is saying, okay, actually, there's another force, another player here that can actually play a more significant role. Where does that put really the role of the government, both local and, otherwise?
Well, the point is that up until now, the government or local government didn't have an interest in creating those spaces. When you are mayor, for example, and you have a conflict, separating the powers is the most immediate and effective solution. And I'm not criticizing them for them. Let's set up dialogue groups. No, I mean, you want to separate. That's immediate, and that's a natural reaction in a sense. And it happened in all divided cities. The first reaction to conflict is segregation, self-segregation or institutional. But the business sector always had an interest of kind of creating shared spaces. For course, it was a financial interest. It wasn't for coexistence or any kind of contact, right? But they had to because they want the consuming power of the Palestinians. They want the working force of the Palestinians because they don't have Jewish workers that can come and work with them. They have kind of self-interest in this. And they created these environments that we can learn from, trying to understand in which situations Jews and Arabs do feel comfortable with one another, and where and what happens then. Of course, it's not optimal at all, right? What happens in the shopping mall. It's very superficial, and it just allows people to feel safe enough to come and want to come back, right? Nothing really comes. You can't really say that it has any positive effect, especially between consumers. It does get more. It has more potential among the workers within these shopping malls. When Jews and Arabs work in the same shop for long hours together, that already brings us to the terms of the contact hypothesis. But anyway, I'm just giving this example because I did learn from the shopping malls of Jerusalem and trying to implement some of the rules that work there within the open public spaces. How can you create this environment? And the first thing that separates between them, or the difference between those two kind of spaces, is the question of management. Public spaces are not managed, usually, especially like parks. They're managed in a very physical, basic level, but there's no one to attend to if there's problems, right? So one of the things we recommend is you have to locate the shared spaces or the spaces of encounter and start manage them intentionally with funds and money. Otherwise, it won't work. They will become places of fear, geographies of fear. They will become this zero-sum game, or in some instances, some spaces in Jerusalem, like the promenade in Armon HaNatziv, nobody comes there. In some, they become deserted, they become marginal, and they are amazing, beautiful spaces, but we lose them because of this conflict. Or the other approach is the Elad, if you know, the settler group, right? They take over spaces in order to make them safe for Jews only. This is not what we intend, right? Even if they are successful in reviving them by the activity, but we're trying to find a way of reviving urban spaces in a way that works for both parts. So management is a key role, but also the question of representation, of language, do we have ads or any kind of direction in Arabic in those spaces? Usually not. Usually if you have Arabic in some of these spaces, it's only those signs that, how do you call them, that threats you or
warning
signs. Sometimes only in Arabic. Right? Don't step on the grass. Only on Arabic. So that's kind of gets the opposite of what we're trying to get here. So bilingual. The language is very important. Some activities, right? What kind of activities can we do? Some of the questions are basic questions of what we call urban renewal. But the idea is to focus the efforts of urban renewal in those kind of very tension spaces of encounter. So, for example, we know already how to go to a square within a random city and create more activity, create more walkability, right, shades, and etc. We have all those sets of rules of creating successful spaces. And the idea is, okay, let's use those tools, but within those very important spaces in the city, the spaces of boundaries. And we don't have all the solution. One of the ideas behind this document is also bring this up to a conversation to the professional people. Just make them aware. Okay, we have some sets of ideas for you, but you to start working on this idea. But your local knowledge might be even more efficient here.
Jerusalem is burdened with a deep and growing poverty. How do you think the social economic effects of the last 2 decades shape the city's trajectory and its possibilities for urban renewal?
Jerusalem gets poorer and poorer by all kinds of indictments, right? Statistical data, and etc. It just dropped to level 2 out of 10 in the socioeconomic ladder.
From the bottom, that is, right?
From the bottom, 2 out of 10. 2 out of 10. It's the poorest large city in Israel, and it's a disgrace, an unbelievable fact. Some of the data does not really reflect everything, the income and etc., because we talk about Haredi and Palestinian population. Many of them have other sources of income which are unofficial or informal, yes, and also the general arrangement of money and how it goes around in the families is different. So it doesn't show the whole. We do have at the same time a growing Haredi and Palestinian middle class. So in spite of the fact that Jerusalem drops in the socioeconomic ladder, there is a small growing strata of middle class. And if we look at the data, we saw that the majority of the middle class up to 10 years ago was non-Haredi Jewish, and now we dropped down to 60% of the Jerusalem middle class. And there are 20 and 20% approximately Palestinian and Haredi. And that has a potential. Because I'm going back to neoliberalism and globalization. Once people join this general idea of middle class, of Bourguignon, right, the Bourgeois, they become a bit more similar, in a sense. They look for the same things in their daily life and habits of life. That's why the malls emerge as a space of encounter, because everybody, if you're middle class, you have a ticket to the shopping mall, right? Basically, that's the idea. They want you there. And you're exposed to popular culture from around the world and etc. And also your, I would say, agenda become more complex between the individualism and nationalism, and there are competing sets of interests here. And so that's so there is one potential in here that in some indirect ways we become more similar, but another thing is, of course, the change in face of Jerusalem. We talked about it before the program, about the demography, the change in demography of the city, and the fact that it used to be dominated by secular Jews up to the 90s, basically. That was the hegemonic group, politically, economically, whatever. Right? Teddy Kollek was the symbol of it. 30 years, a mayor from the Israeli left, with a coalition, with a single party, dominated the municipality coalition. Unbelievable today, right? And then it rapidly changes during the 2000s, and today secular Jews are a small minority. So I think that eventually Jerusalem is becoming a Haredi Palestinian city. De facto, it already is. Together, they are consisting 65 to 70% of the city's population. Unfortunately, at the same time, those two populations are mostly hostile to one another more than to any other population. And nobody attends this issue of the Haredi-Palestinian relations. Unfortunately, Haredim became a main target of Palestinian political violence, of terror acts around the old city, right? They recognize them easily as a Jew. It's not against ultra-Orthodox, but you can't be mistaken by seeing a Haredi and saying that's a Jew if you want to attack a Jewish person, and they become more and more in the city, demographically, etc. So, but the middle class of those two populations are not in the game of radicalization. They taking those society to the other side slowly, but they are more Israelized in a way, right? They are more into integration in a sense. So it's kind of marginal and kind of hanging on very small fruits here. But I think if you're trying to identify where to invest is in these ideas of those middle classes and etc.
Yeah, do you think that really Jerusalem is, back to the future sort of thing? I mean, this is where Israel will be in a few decades' time.
If you go to Zion Square, there's always a figure there that it reminds me of Back to the Future, because if you ask me in the 80s, kind of 90s, what would be in the future in Jerusalem, I would imagine a Haredi person with electric guitar playing hard rock. And this is what you find in Zion Square. There was this guy, a Haredi guy playing Pink Floyd with his electric guitar, and it's surreal. It looks really surreal. He does it all day long, day after day. And I think it symbolizes where Jerusalem is going to. And in some aspects, Israel as a whole. Jerusalem is different from Israel. It's not going to be the same demography, but you can see the hybrid identities that are created in Jerusalem that I think are going to be more and more dominant. So this Israeli Haredi guy plays Pink Floyd. That's something that, we should understand. That's a growing thing, right? With the Palestinians, it's, of course, more complex. When I talked about Israelization, for example, among Palestinians, that's a very complex development that kind of brings up questions of normalization and what about their identity as Palestinians and etc. But it's a process that's happening. You go to the Mount Scopus campus and you go to the forum, the middle space, and Yael knows what I'm talking about, and there's a dominance of Palestinians from East Jerusalem. That's another glimpse of Israeli future. Those hybridities that are very conflictual and are not exactly what we as a secular liberals or whatever would like to see. They're not going to think like we want them to think, right? But there are something new. They're also not going to be exactly what they came from. In a sense, that gives you a glimpse of some of the futures of Israel.
Just about that, I think it's really interesting because recently the Bezalel Smotrich, who is Minister of the Treasury, worked. He declared he would stop the funding for the East Jerusalemites studying at Hebrew University, exactly for that reason, because of the presence that is there. So it's very timely and very explosive, this issue. But we also have, for the first time since East Jerusalem came under Israeli conquest more than half a century ago, an East Jerusalem Palestinian has launched a bid for mayor in the municipal elections, which will take place in November this year. Actually, the 31st of October, I think. Oh. Do you think it's a game changer or just a publicity stunt?
Not a game changer. And I would say, unfortunately, as an Israeli Jew, secular, that still lives in Jerusalem, my dream is that the Palestinians would vote for the municipality, but that's mostly out of self-interest, because I want them to change the political game within the municipality, and they would if they would vote, but I don't see it happening. We actually, from my observation, as much as the other modes of integration of Palestinians in Jerusalem, in West Jerusalem, are increasing in work, in education, in daily life, they keep the political boundaries even more intact. You actually saw a lower rate of participation in local election, as much as it can get lower, from 2% to 1% in the last elections. So they put the political walls even higher to safeguard them or their identities
And allow for the integration.
within this process of individual.
How do you explain it, though? Why hasn't this process of integration increasing presence in the Jewish space not infiltrated the political arena, do you think?
Well, that's about a barrier that I don't see change in the near future, but kind of it seems that eventually it would have to happen. It's because there will be a growing appetite for a change. And first of all, I see this process, not like Bezalel Smotrich, right, as a very important process in Jerusalem. The fact that thousands of Palestinians from East Jerusalem are now gaining Israeli higher education. I think that this kind of economic empowerment and social mobility that it will allow them, even though limited within the stratification of Israeli job market and etc., but for their sense of, being within Jerusalem, it's highly important for the Palestinian society that they grow in a new generation that is different and stronger.
So at some point you think it will spill over into political participation?
It seems so, but this is why all the political fragments are fighting against it right now.
Okay, Dr. Marik Shtern, fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Policy Research, the co-author of the recently published report, Shared Spaces in Contested Cities, a Model for Analysis and Development. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And also many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios, and to the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for their generous support. And now we've got a request, because many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we have a special request. Please consider writing us a review. Good, bad, ugly, up to you. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has probably close to 1,000 interviews by now. Like us on Facebook, follow me and Yael on Twitter, and most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from us here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.